Wow, welcome. Thanks for having me. That was an overly generous introduction, but I appreciate it. I often do get the question, so where are you based? Because I hear you everywhere, and I say I'm based in a dusty, remote outpost known as Los Angeles. Very rural. No, but I do think people in Western cities do tend to have a little bit more connection with the rural environment, I think, I dare say, than maybe some in the East Coast. That's just my observation. Because we're surrounded by it. Even in Los Angeles, you're an hour and a half away from vast tracts of Bureau of Land Management land. This is right outside our office. I'm joking, that's not true. Since you brought up Clive and Bundy, that is the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. And I like to tell this story. We were sort of discussing, well, what are you going to talk about? And we kind of quickly punted and called it Reporter's Notebook, but they wanted to hear, the folks organizing this wanted to hear some real stories from the ground, and there's a lot of disconnect, as I probably don't have to tell you, with what we're hearing nationally and what we're actually seeing out on the ground in rural Western towns and communities like Burns, Oregon, that's had a rocky time transitioning from a natural resource-based economy to what it might be next and balancing, where to go forward. But I like to tell this story because I remember jumping on a plane and racing to get to Boise, which was 3 hours or so drive from Burns, Oregon, but it's the nearest airport or nearest large airport to get to. And on that plane, there's, half of the plane, it seemed at the time, half of the plane was full of people like myself, national correspondents racing to cover this sort of sagebrush rebellion, Old West standoff, like the cowboys taking a stand out there on behalf of the ranchers. Well, the other half of the plane were all Syrian refugees who were moving to Boise. And relocating to Boise. And in that airport, in the baggage claim, as we were all racing to get out to the Old West, is this very changing West in the baggage claim of family reunification. Family members who hadn't seen each other for years, maybe. Boise has a very robust refugee resettlement program. So I tell that story because it seems like there was this whole other story right underneath our nose that we weren't covering, and I can just imagine if I had called my on-call duty editor in D.C. at the time and said, well, we should maybe cover this. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't cover the 41-day standoff that ensued, but that's where all the news media was, covering the Old West, right? The Bundys were trying to seize on the angst and anxieties, mostly economic, in a county that was 90% plus U.S. federal land. But when you're out there on the ground, you realize that these stories, they're not black and white. And in fact, the Bundys were met with a lot of opposition right there in the local community because maybe they sympathized with some of the issues that they were trying to bring up about arguments with the federal government over the years, but they had their own very robust steering committee of ranchers and public lands managers who for years were trying to cool the tensions. And today, I can tell you that they're starting to figure things out, but it's not necessarily making the national news. I just got a press release about, I wasn't going to show you a photo of the press release, about a shuttered timber mill in Burns, Oregon, technically Hines, it's next to it, but it's the same town, you wouldn't know, that was bought by an investor, and they're importing German technology to reopen the mill, but reopen the mill in a way that the local farmers can bring their alfalfa, which can be then created into pellets, which becomes animal feed and exported out of there. I don't know if it's going to be as many jobs, but it's something. So my point being, there's stuff going on in a lot of these communities that aren't getting the national attention. Maybe if I go there, it's very remote. It's a hard pitch to sell an editor on. If it's not me, it's maybe Julie from the New York Times based in Denver who's flying there. That's not to say local reporters can't cover it, but it doesn't gain as much traction. And also it's not as interesting. There's not as much attention. So it doesn't get as much national attention, but I tell that story because these are things that are happening on the ground that I see. We talked about the 2016 election. David mentioned that. I think there was a lot of hand-wringing and soul-searching by the news media, NPR included, of, how could we have missed this? How could we have missed this populist sort of sentiment going on? And there were promises to double down and cover this better, but I dare say the news media is not following through with those commitments today, and this hurts our region. We're still letting the national politicians largely drive the narrative. Well, the narrative from the national politicians is frequently, I don't have to tell this room, not exactly what you hear on the ground. When I'm out in communities, take a guess what I hear all the time. If I were to go out and ask what the big issues are in any town, whether it be the Aspen amenity economy or I'm spacing the name of the county. I should know this. It's not Malheur County, but in Oregon? What is it, sorry? Harney County. Yes, thank you. Sorry. You get $20. They say, the people in all these places say housing. Housing is a big issue. Healthcare, that's the big issue. And education, access to education, which was brought up, I believe, in that 1909 report. But yet, nationally, the news media and all the power brokers can't quite figure out why everybody is so disconnected with Washington. But it's interesting to see kind of how even non-amenity counties are going in one direction. There are some exceptions, but they're kind of going in a direction that is not necessarily what we're hearing on the national level. So to that, we'll travel, in our reporter's notebook here, we'll travel about 4 hours east of here, 5 hours east of here, to Hotchkiss, Colorado. Has anybody been there? It's in the North Fork Valley. There were 3 large coal mines that were operating until a couple of years ago when people talk about the shock, which is 2 of the 3 coal mines shut down, which was not a surprise to anybody, coal miners included. Many actually had seen the writing on the wall and were trying to get jobs over here in Utah and a couple places up in Montana, but there just aren't a lot of coal jobs left, despite it being now such a politically charged topic. This valley knew that you talk to the miners. Robbie Clements, he had been working underground since 1980. He's had 17 surgeries in 12 years. This is his daughter with him in their home. He had just recently retired. I'm forgetting which mine it was from. He's 59. He told me that in the mornings are good. It'd be better if you came by in the mornings. I get pretty sluggish and achy by the afternoons. But he and many others will candidly say, we're not surprised by this. The cheap stuff is out of the ground. These jobs are going away, so what do we do? Well, in that town, it just so happened that the Rural Electric Co-op got USDA grant money and other money to expand broadband to that valley. How do you compete in today's economy if you don't have access to fast internet, especially in a rural area? The thinking there might be that they would attract new residents as well if they had faster internet. But the cool thing that's happened is, so Michelle, who you see in that photo, she went into the mining industry just like her father. She actually worked at 17. She was one of the only women in the mine at that time in the North Fork Valley, and eventually gets a job working HR. She went to college at Mesa State, and I guess it's called Colorado Mesa now, in Grand Junction, and she went to college and got a job in the HR for corporate mining, and is in West Virginia, ends up going overseas for a stint, lands back in Salt Lake City. But where does she really want to live? She wants to live in her hometown where she grew up. She wants to see her hometown thrive. Her hometown was emptying out. All the coal miners had to leave. But as a result of the efforts to expand broadband, what's happened? Well, people are able to move back. There are 2 companies that have sprung up that are tech companies that are employing hundreds of people in that valley as a result of some federal money, but also a lot of local vision, right? And so what happened to Michelle is that she was working over here in Salt Lake City for a couple of years, and for her, Salt Lake City is huge. It's bustling, traffic. I mean, the traffic's terrible, of course. Where isn't it? But she wanted to move home, and she got a job working for Lightworks Fiber back in Hotchkiss, Colorado, a headquartered company working a professional job with benefits. And a lot of the former coal miners are retrained to work in fiber optics. So this is sort of a success story. The lead to that story was that, well, rural America is not this monolithic thing. There are actually places that are doing quite well. It's not like every place is struggling. Sure, people in Hotchkiss have the same issues that many people would have anywhere else in the West or in the Deep South or what have you. But it was interesting in reporting that story because it shows that while the national politicians, the elephant in the room, Donald Trump, is saying we're going to bring coal back, here's a conservative county that largely went for Trump, where people on the ground are like, well, no, we can't really do that because we see what's happening and we need to figure this out. And so they go the other way. That's that disconnect that I'm seeing, and probably many of you are seeing all over the region. And it's interesting, we talked about the hand-wringing after the election, and the national politicians talking about rural America carried us and we're going to help them. How often do you guys hear about rural America in national politics right now? I'll answer for you, not that much, right? That's where you're supposed to say, nah. Tom Vilsack put it to me this way, the former Iowa governor, agriculture secretary for 8 years under Obama. He would say, in a story that I was reporting out of Idaho, I called him up to ask why there wasn't why he thought maybe there wasn't as much of an understanding of the role of the federal government in many of these counties, in particular these rural western counties that are transitioning, and how much federal money is spent there. He said the federal government doesn't do a great job promoting itself and telling its own story. But I asked him about the rural disconnect, and he said, politicians, they say they want to help rural America. They get here, they find out it's super complex, and they're running on 2-year cycles, 4-year, maybe 6. And these are issues, the housing issue, the transition to a recreational economy issue, the broadband issue even, these are taking years to solve. The gaps in education. And these are tricky, and they take a long time, and politicians leave because it's just, there aren't the votes out there. We mentioned, so I think as a result, you're seeing communities kind of take it on their own as much as they can. I live in California, which is having a record snow year. We mentioned this story that I just did up in Mammoth Lakes. You guys all been to the Eastern Sierra? They call it the wild side of California. 2 counties, roughly the size of Massachusetts, 50,000 people total, maybe bigger than Massachusetts. But they've seen on the Inyo, this photo is not really that great of an example, but on the Inyo National Forest, they see 2 million visitors a year. And that, despite what you see in that photo, it does look like we're out in the outpost there. But this is a community that's gone all in with a recreational economy. Obviously, their entire economy is based on U.S. public lands. Their famous ski resort is a Forest Service lease. People in Utah know all there is to know about that. But at the same time that communities on the Eastern Sierra, and not just the prosperous ones, Bishop, California, about 50 miles away, was a largely mining and agriculture town, and for many years, the source of Los Angeles' water. In the 1990s, they began to transition to a climbing mecca. and an outdoor recreation mecca, and drawing in businesses that were outdoor apparel manufacturers or people who could work remotely, people who wanted to live in the middle of nowhere, as they say. Well, all the time that this has been happening, all these counties have been, and I know my audience here, you guys probably know all this, so I'll speed this up, but they've been going all in with marketing public lands. Well, at the same time, there's been about a 20% decrease in funding for managing all these lands. It's been going on. The town councilor who pitched this to me said it's been going on since the 80s, but he calls it a shrinking federal presence. So how are you supposed to deal with all these visitors to the amenities that you are promoting if there's nobody managing them and if they're being loved to death? In Mammoth's case, things really hit home during the first shutdown. Folks around there, it being a blue pocket of the Eastern Sierra, will disgruntlingly say the Ted Cruz shutdown in 2013, when the government wasn't around to staff the trailheads or manage any of the land right around the ski resort. And another interesting thing, the cannons that, because there's so much snow this winter in particular, the explosives and the operations of the avalanche control on the resort, who pays for that? Federal taxpayers, the Forest Service. So when all that shuts down, they're like, what do we do? So instead of the hand-wringing, like I said, they got together and tried to figure out what we could do on our own. So they passed a local sales tax and utility tax to fund staffing at gateways to U.S. public land, which are all around the town. I'm sure there may be something similar here in Park City, forgive my ignorance, but obviously we're mostly also surrounded by federal land. Herein lies another thing. The national government is trying to push, you could say for great reasons, more jobs in the timber sector again on federal land. But those jobs, they may pay better than outdoor recreation, but there just aren't as many of them. You visit a timber town, people will tell you the technology is such that not as many people are needed in the woods. Outdoor recreation, as I've reported in that story, accounts for tenfold in most rural western counties than does traditional resources. And in fact, the rural western, I think you guys are calling it amenity counties, is that right? These are the only counties largely to see in-migration and population increases after the recession. But there's a lot of tension around that. I mean, technically my beat that is the urban-rural divide, and these jobs, at least so far, don't tend to pay as much. They don't pay as much as, a lot of them are seasonal so far. They don't pay as much as the timber mill jobs did back in the day. So after the 2016 election, in part because a lot of editors didn't know what was happening, didn't know what happened, and some of us out in the field, in particular some of us who had covered the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge standoff, had a hint of what was going to happen. Perhaps we weren't as surprised at what happened as some of the other people on the coasts. But I got a very long leash to travel the rural West and talk to people and find out what's happening. And actually, to some extent, I still do this. So what did I do? I went to a place that was close to where I grew up, and in Idaho, a timber town in Idaho called Orofino, gold and silver, where 2 timber mills had shut down right before the election. And wanted to see what people thought of the new president. We're getting a Skype call from the back, I think. I met a guy in the bar. His name was Jerry, and he was laid off, working in the woods. And I actually forgot to bring the soundbite because it's a great soundbite. But he basically said, tech companies didn't build this country. You can say what you want, but it's the resources that built this country. The timber, the mining, that's what makes it all possible. I didn't ask him further, but I was assuming he was, grumbling about the nearest city. Well, what's the nearest city? That's Seattle. What's driving the economy there? The tech. Who's making all that possible? Jerry's making it possible with his resource development. On the flip side, in the city, they may point to Orofino, Idaho, and say, well, who's keeping you afloat? All of our federal tax money via USDA rural development and Commerce Department grants. And why, by the way, do you get 10 times more say in the Electoral College than us? But where was I going with that one? But I guess I would say that in the end, in some of these communities that I visit, there is kind of an understanding that a lot of people have some of the same similar issues. I was struck by visiting Orofino and asking people, well, what's the cause for the decline in the timber industry? And by the way, when you visit Clearwater County, Idaho, it's the poorest county in Idaho, lowest per capita income. But there's plenty of logging activity still happening, which I was surprised about. But people there said, I'm sure if I had searched far enough, I could have found somebody who pointed the finger at the environmentalists. But people said, it's technology, it's imports from Canada, we don't need as many people to work in these places. And they will say that, the weather's also changing, things are different. And in fact, in Orofino, near Orofino, there's a giant forest collaborative project that's been ongoing that you can point to several of these success stories around the West. They do not make the news as much as the fights over land and the lawsuits and the armed takeovers, but these are the things that are actually happening quite a bit more than I think we in the news media tend to focus on. In places like Orofino, I dare say, I hope I'm not misinformed in this, but I do think that the hostility or the perception of reporters is a little overblown. A lot of people are very excited to welcome me into their homes and share their stories. I was there at a jet boat manufacturing company. Orofino, Idaho is a place that's got a lot of natural resources, but there are some people who are also trying to see the writing on the wall. They've got older people moving in, they've got young people moving out. The older people are moving in to fly fish and retire. The jobs are going away. So I met a guy who started a jet boat manufacturing. They've got a big wide river. It's very shallow, the Clearwater River, and you can ride jet boats on it for fishing. Met a guy on the line, on the assembly line, was good to talk, and he said, my dad worked in the woods, my grandfather did, and those jobs are going away, and I need to be retrained in something else. But it was important to him and many of his friends who I met to stay in their town. And I guess the point of saying all this is that, these are, I think we think of rural America as being one big monolithic thing, like David said, but, these are very complex. They don't fit into boxes. All the issues there are, require a lot of attention, and we in the press could be doing a better job shining a light on them. Looks like I have 5 minutes. They asked me to tell a quick story, and I'll take questions if anybody has questions. I was asked to tell, when was the last time you were in Utah? So I thought it'd be really nice to talk about a super chill, very not political county known as San Juan County, Utah. And you can see off in the distance there. Did you guys know what those are? There's the Bears Ears. But herein is another example of how I think we run the risk of coming into something with preconceived notions. I do a lot of parachuting into communities. I grew up in the quasi-rural West, Missoula, Montana. It's not particularly rural. In fact, even in the rural West, you can see an urban-rural divide. If you visit Bozeman, if you visit Bend, Park City, and then you go to Blanding, Utah. But, you read the campaign statements from the oil and gas industry, House Republicans. They cast it as federal government's coming into Bears Ears and they're going to take over the land and it's going to lock it all up. Well, then you read Patagonia or you watch the Patagonia videos on YouTube and it's a cast about, the the environmentalists are protecting all of the antiquities and the artifacts in that place, and we need to do this. Well, when you visit the town, Blanding, when I rolled into town, stopped at the, I think it was the museum, the little museum they have there. What did I hear? And I'm always a little sensitive to this because I know we wear reporter jackets and it takes a good 5 days to really understand what's going on. If there had been a bar in Blanding, I may have been there to hang out at night to find out, but it's a majority Mormon community and it's a dry town. But what did people say right out of the gate? They said they were offended by a large national monument designation because they were worried that all these people would come in and it wouldn't be managed and the land would be trampled. Well, where have we heard that before? In a blue county. So I found myself rejiggering my story a little bit. This man, by the way, is Ferd Johnson, who I suggested we hike into the canyon because I'd heard a lot about it, but it's called Recapture Canyon. You probably know it quite well. This is not an illegal ATV ride that was that happened there a couple of years ago. And Ferd actually did not participate in that ride, but he was eager to show me how he knew the land. He just knew it a lot differently. He grew up there, and the way he got around the land was with that ATV, not a mountain bike. Since we're running out of time here and no to go to questions, I'll end with a quick little anecdote that at NPR, we do hostile environment training, all correspondents. It used to be that we had to have hostile environment training before we deploy overseas to any sort of international incident. Well, increasingly, we're finding a hostile environment in the US. So more domestic correspondents are doing hostile environment training. So take a guess. So you could be covering a war, you could be covering Ferguson, you could be interviewing Clive and Bundy on the Bundy standoff or at the ranch 2 months after, where I walk into the ranch house with two young men who are armed. What is the biggest danger that reporters face? What is the biggest, what do you think statistically the biggest risk is when you're out traveling, be it around the US or internationally? There's actually two. Car accident and dog bites. And I went up to pet that dog, and Ferd said, no, don't do that. So anyway, that's the end of that story. He didn't bite me. But I do kind of love that photo because it kind of encapsulates a bunch of different things. So does anybody have any questions? I kind of ran through a bunch of things all at once. Yep?
Coming back to job training, which seems essential given the change in employment out here, what's your view of whether the government's good or bad? Equal jobs should be the private sector, should be the states. What would you job training in the rural West?
I'd probably use the case of, not because it's the only important place, but Orofino, Idaho, just because after the election I've been trying to visit the same communities instead of just going all over the place. And in Orofino's case, they have a pretty robust state of Idaho job training program, but I think you're seeing, which may get federal Department of Commerce grants filtered through the state, but I think what you're seeing is a lot of public-private partnerships being leveraged wherever possible to train people. In the case of Hotchkiss, Colorado, there wasn't extensive training needed because a lot of the guys laying fiber optic cable were already working in fields similar to construction. I think I would flip that question on its head and say there are jobs in many of these communities. In fact, that jet boat manufacturer guy I talked about, the owner of that company, said he couldn't find enough workers. And he, secondly, couldn't find workers who were willing to come back. Which brings up a whole host of other issues. But, I think job training is probably essential, and I worry that we're not covering this as the national media follows Trump at every single second and lets those national politicians cover it, when what's actually happening on the ground are some very ironically, just festering issues many of the things that were the case 100 years ago. So, yes.
When I traveled the state of Utah as an Irish Catholic candidate for governor, the one place that I would always go is elementary schools, because kids really do speak the truth and often are repeating what they hear at home. Do you, in your visits to these communities, go to the elementary schools and talk with the kids?
Yes. In fact, because we know that if you don't know anybody in a community, it's funny that you bring that up. If you're coming in cold, the first place you want to go is the school, because that is the center of the community. You introduce yourself to the principal or the superintendent in a small town, that person knows everyone via the school. Chances are good that a lot of people in town work at the school or they work in government jobs. So yes, is the answer to that. There's a town, it's not in the West, but I went to a conference in rural Illinois a couple of years ago, and I asked our news assistant at the time, like, I want to go to a county, and I've heard it's in the Midwest. Can we find the fastest depopulating county in America? Well, sure enough, there was one right at the southern tip of Illinois. And I was going to go down there to ask folks with just one question. Usually I arrive in town with one big question, and I ask everybody that. And I have one guide who kind of navigates me through. And I wanted to find out what were they doing to reverse that trend. And boy, did I find a hornet's nest there, which we don't have time to get into. But I went to the school because that was where everybody worked. And that's how I found a great story, because people trust somebody in the school, they vouch for you, then suddenly you're sitting. I mean, it's baffling how quickly I'll be sitting in somebody's living room, 2 states away from where I started my day, and they've just welcomed me in. There's a lot of talk about there being all this angst and anxiety, and let's call it what it is as well. Some of it is ranting in lots of parts of the country, in particular the rural West, or people feeling as though they've been left behind, which is a very valid, concern, because they're not having the same level of income and jobs that their parents and their grandparents may have back in the day. But I went to visit this couple in New Mexico, rural southern New Mexico, because I had read that they were fighting the federal government, and the Bundys had tried to show up to their county to highlight them, and they were actually turned away and said, no, we're going to do this the legal way through the courts, and we're going to win, we think. And they did in their battle against the Forest Service. But there was a couple who had a huge mistrust of national media or a community of outsiders. But when I told them that I rarely say Los Angeles. I'll be flying in from California, Denver, or Colorado. I use my cell phone area code. I don't lie. But they were impressed that a reporter was willing to jump on a plane. And I said it was Tuesday, and I was like, are you around Thursday morning? And they were like, pardon? But we do that. So NPR still does that. I shouldn't be ripping on the national media so much, but people just want to be heard, basically.
Kirk, what evidence do you see, if any, that the 2017 Tax Act provision for so-called opportunity zones is having any effect in the rural West?
Interesting that you mentioned that. So the reason I was in Mammoth was not to ski, but the gentleman was organizing a conference of folks from mostly amenities-based rural towns, ski towns, Durangos, but there were also people from actual Northern California, as they say, the North State, in different little towns that have really struggled with logging. I'm spacing the name of the exact town. I think it's Susanville or somewhere near, but somebody, again, not something that gets highlighted. In fact, this is on my story list. My story list is so overwhelming that I can't even get to any of it. But there's an investor who used the opportunity, I'm not an expert in these, but there was a barely advertised provision in the very controversial Republican Mitch McConnell tax overhaul that actually is showing some success in rural America. And in this particular case, they've created an opportunity zone where I believe this is in the middle of the Sierra Nevada, it's a shrimp farm and a converted mill, and it's employing a lot of people. I think it's Susanville, something like that, but that's on my list for sure. I think that there are other examples of this that are kind of getting drowned out as the MSNBCs and the CNNs and the Foxes focus on how's that going to play for Democrats? How's that going to play for Republicans? I guess MSNBC and CNN do that. The Fox only focuses on one end of things. But, we're having an huge internal debate within NPR about whether or not our coverage is driven too heavily by what's on those cable news networks. And in fact, we have 5 times the audience of some of their top-rated shows. We could be driving the narrative better. We could be shining a light on those opportunity zones as an example. But I think there are people it's my understanding that people are very interested in those as a way, in particular, to help, it's not all counties are going from traditional natural resource development full on into outdoor rec. There are a lot of examples, actually in Utah in particular, of counties that are kind of hybrids. They've got the traditional economy, the ranching, the mining, but then they're also drawing in some new residents with new entrepreneurs, the ability to do something. And let's face it, a lot of people want to live in these places. And now increasingly they can because the internet's a lot better. And the rural West is still a little bit challenging. It was interesting, I battle a lot of East Coast kind of perceptions because most of our management is there. Nothing against the East Coast. My extended family grew up in the East Coast. My dad, who's in the room, was born in the East Coast. So that's the qualification. But the fact is, what they think of as rural America, sure, it's rural and isolated when you get there, but where we go out to do our hostile environment training, you might hear a gunshot. It's in rural Virginia. Does that really count as rural when you're 2 hours from Washington, D.C., versus if you're in the Arizona Strip, BLM, big chunk of BLM land out by the canyons and the Grand Canyon? How far are you from Salt Lake City? I was out there interviewing Lavoy Finicum's wife in Colorado City, and at one point I'd flown into Salt Lake City, and I had driven so far, and I looked at my phone, and I realized I was closer to my house than the Salt Lake Airport where my car rental came from. So yeah, I think we have different challenges out here. It's certainly more isolated, but I think you'll see a lot of, and you are seeing, and you have been seeing for several decades, a lot of rural western places capitalizing on their scenic beauty. Hotchkiss, Colorado, Paonia, Colorado, that area is certainly one of them. Yes? Yeah.
So you mentioned housing, but you didn't really sort of expand it. I can imagine there are many different dimensions of a housing problem, ranging from the indoor plumbing to the expense, what's happening with prices as a result of the gentrification of the area. But specifically, what kinds of housing issues do you see as more critical? And are they distinctive from the kinds of issues that we see, say, with gentrification in the city?
Some of them are similar, but I think in rural... the question was about what sort of similarities or differences am I hearing from people in rural areas about the housing crisis than I might be in the city? Is it all about gentrification or is it about other things? I'd use the example of the Paradise, California wildfire as a good thing to point to. That's a county that already had a severe housing shortage before the fire hit, and then suddenly 20% of their entire housing stock was knocked out in a day. But in that place, like I think a lot of the rural West, you can't get, there aren't enough contractors. Building materials cost more. Building materials cost more in general now in the cities. And it's hard to get, I'd say one of the biggest distinctions is it's hard to get an investor, a land developer to come out to these places because they're not sure there's going to be a return on their investment. And that may even happen in like the Roaring Fork Valley in Colorado because land is so expensive. That's another reason why they're not building more affordable housing, because nobody can afford the land to put the structures on. But I think in answer to your question, I think you're seeing a lot of, there's not enough labor, building materials cost a lot more, and the remoteness of it. I mean, even if you're in Mammoth Lakes, California, it's 3 hours to Reno, 5 hours to LA, and 6 to San Francisco or the Bay Area. So you're pretty far out there. So yes, it may be a desirable place to live, and it's seeing an influx of people, but how do you get the labor, and where do people live? So hope that answered your question. Yes, one last question.
And looking ahead to the next presidential election, are the Democratic candidates saying things that you think would appeal to the populist conservatives in the West?
Gosh, I almost feel like we need a timeout, even in hearing about the presidential election. It just seems so far away. I haven't been listening that closely. I've heard Amy say a number of things up in Minnesota. But as a cynic, I mean, it would sound like they're playing up those. It will be interesting to see how much rural issues play later on in the campaign after the Iowa caucus. It's like we fit this pattern. Like, well, we're going to Iowa, we're going to talk about farmers. Well, actually, in rural America, only 2% of the workforce is farmers. But that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about rural America then. Maybe as we move on to other places, we won't as much. So I'll do the classic reporter punt to that question and say it will be interesting to see how that plays out.
So I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Kirk.